Hey, hi everyone. I'm going to take you through a pretty wide breadth of topics related to old growth forests. I wish I could dive deep on any one particular one, but I want to give you the wide scope of the ecology of these places, some of our conservation issues, and some of the solutions that we have looking ahead to make sure that these really important ecosystems have a future. So I'm with the Old Growth Forest Network, which is a national nonprofit focused on protecting the remaining old growth forests that we have in America today and creating a future for them for future generations. We work across the country, and we've been around for 14 years working on this, and so that's only a little snippet of time when you're a tree that can grow up to 600 years old. But we are doing what we can in human lifetimes to help protect things that far outlive us. So I want to take you into an old growth forest. They are really remarkable places, and it kind of follows the idea of you know it when you see it, and you know it when you feel it. So in these forests, when you give them a long amount of time undisturbed or separated from large human impacts, they take on really wonderful qualities. So in our eastern deciduous forests and some of our temperate forests in the west, you might go into an old forest and see really large trees, see a lot of downed logs. You might find one in particular that is a really wonderful padded mossy seat. And if you sit on that log, you might hear warblers threading the air above you as they jump between the complex canopies and layers of these forests. You might see a lot more lichen and fungi and mosses than you would in younger forests. You might hear different sounds because certain species have to wait for forests to grow much older until they have the ideal habitat for those species to live in. And you might feel more relaxed because there's a lot of aspects of old growth forests that lower blood pressure, make us feel a sense of relaxation, and I'm sure there's a lot of research that could be done about what is in the air that we're breathing and those chemical signals that are coming from the complex biodiversity around us that time has created over many centuries. And so I want to give you a quick overview of what an old growth forest is. And a helpful concept is the idea of forest succession to understand how we get to the point to have a forest that we can all call old growth. So forests predictably follow this pathway generally. Every forest is a little different, and they don't read textbooks that tell you what forest succession looks like. But when you have a forest that has been cleared essentially by a major disturbance like wind, fire, or insects, where you lose the majority of the canopy and you have kind of a wide open space. We have stand initiation, where you have sun-loving trees, often that like poor soil, and shrubs and grasses that grow. But over time, you will see an early successional young forest develop. And here in the southeast in our area, oftentimes those are the pine species that are colonizing these areas first and growing up and forming that canopy. And as that canopy grows a little older, you start to see recruitment of more shade-tolerant species. And here that is generally our hardwood species. So they start growing in the understory, and this is kind of our canopy transition phase as that forest grows older. And oftentimes the species mix grows more diverse. And then over time, it starts to grow into our late successional forest or old growth forest. There is no specific numbers or ages or anything like that to tell you where these things transition. Every forest is going to operate a little differently according to the environmental factors, where you are in the country, the types of species that live there, and their lifespans. So I didn't put an age on here, but generally here in the southeast, we start to see these late successional characteristics come on at about 120 or 150 years, when that canopy has had time for the pine species in particular to kind of live out their natural lifespans, and the hardwood species to start forming that canopy. And so on my drive in on 316, they've been clearing forest from the edge of the road. And so it just looks like somebody cut a cake and cleared up until the road. And so if you look at that section of forest there, you'll see skinny pines that are the canopy, but you see an understory of hardwoods there that are about half the height. And so that tells us that that forest there is probably in this end of early succession going into maturing forest stage. So you can actually see that transition. And all of those forests, probably between here and Atlanta, were farmland in the 1950s. And so you can see that transition in action. And then late succession, old growth forest, there's not necessarily an end point to that either. I could put like an infinity symbol here, but eventually there is going to be some sort of disturbance that comes along and resets some part of this forest succession process. Sometimes that might be a major disturbance or a stand replacing disturbance where it kind of levels the forest. We see that with some of the large hurricanes that might come through. Or you'll have small scale, fine grained disturbances that affect a patch of the forest here, patches of different size. And so it grows more complex spatially, vertically. You get a lot of heterogeneity, and it looks more like a quilt in the end. And here's some maps that show us roughly, these are kind of projections of what our virgin forests looked like with European colonization. So virgin forest is a particular term that is forest that was never fully cleared. And old growth is a little different because you can grow back into old growth given those centuries that I talked about. But we did have widespread clearing largely because of agriculture and logging over the past 2 centuries. And I will give a disclaimer that these maps were made in 1926 by a Forest Service employee, and so this was his projection to 1990. We have retained a little more in the east, but he only projected that the Adirondacks up here in upstate New York would exist, but we do have some of the Smokies and we got pockets, but generally this is what we saw happen. And then this is a map of forest age across the United States with the younger age classes in red transitioning to green at about 100 years. And then our blue areas are the oldest forest, and that oldest forest category is actually 191 to 852 years. So it's a very big bucket that we consider old. But you can see the trends that we live in an area that has pretty young forest, relatively. And that is a reflection of that history and the time that forest has been growing since the initial clearing and development. And we live in an area with a lot of timber production. And with timber production, forests are going to stay relatively young because they get cut and planted and regrown. And then you can see some pockets, thankfully, of remaining old growth forests. And one interesting thing I love to point out is you can see Olympic National Park in dark blue, surrounded by industrial timberlands in the Pacific Northwest. And we've put together some guides on what you might see in old growth forests. And they're separated into moist forests and dry forests because old growth forests look differently according to the environmental conditions there and the composition of the species, what's in the soil, how much sun it gets, what the water does. But I just want to give you some examples of things you might see in older forests. So obviously big trees are going to be part of that. Oh, sorry, that's mine. Thought I made it quiet. Big trees and dead trees is a really important factor in older forests. And those are going to be standing dead trees. We call those snags. And you're also going to have logs on the ground and what is called coarse woody debris, which is all of those sticks and branches and things like that have fallen over time and are in the process of decomposition. Sometimes they decompose more quickly in some forests and more slowly in others, but you'll see multiple stages of decomposition, which tells you that these cycles of forest growing, dying, living, decaying are happening over long time spans. You might see interesting things in the canopy where a large tree has fallen and opened up a gap. And because that was one of our big old trees, it's a very large gap, and you look up and you're able to see the sky. But very quickly, other plant species are going to take advantage of that gap and grow into it. So that's where you might see a little bit of younger forest mixed into your older forest. And then trees individually will respond to that gap, and they might send out a branch and take advantage of that light gap that was there. So you'll see these branches kind of making a maze almost. And then we've got lichens, mosses, and things that need really particular conditions. And conditions are typically stable in these older forests. And so the species that need those stable microclimates do much better in older forests. And then in our drier forests, you might have a little bit different conditions here because there's typically going to be a little more sunlight in those forests because you see more conifers and things like that. If you want to dig into these more, you can find them on the Old Growth Forest Network website. And one major thing I want you to walk away with, if you want to know that anything about old growth forests, is you can see a lot, but there's a lot you can't see. And one great example of that is here in our eastern forests, some of our biggest trees are tulip poplars or tulip trees, and they can grow really big really fast. So this is the biggest one in Georgia. And you know, it could be 150, 200, 250 or more. It also, trees this size could be only 100 years old. That's how fast they grow, and it really depends on the conditions that they're growing in. At the same time, this site is not too far. This is just over the line in North Carolina, and these trees are only about 20 to 25 feet tall. And they're only about 15 inches in diameter, maybe 20, but at the larger ones, maybe only 12 inches at the smaller ones, which is really not that big. These trees are 500 years old. And the difference here is the growing conditions. There's different species, but these are white oaks on this side. But these are growing on 3 inches of topsoil. So they are doing the best with what they have. But you'll find really unique differences according to where you are and what the trees have to grow from. So why do we care about old growth forests? This is a unique ecosystem, a unique type of forest in the country where we've seen widespread loss, and it takes really long time spans for these forests to recover. And so they require investment. If we want to see them in the future, we need to change what we're doing. And it's going to take multiple generations of people committing to that same vision to see these forests return. They have unique ecosystem values. With that age comes those unique circumstances that you wouldn't see in a 40-year-old forest, but you will see in a 200-year-old forest. And they often offer a lot of carbon storage in the trees, in the branches, in the leaves, and especially in the soil, because there's been so much time of branches and leaves dropping, trees decomposing, adding to that soil layer. And so you've got a lot of really good values in terms of what big trees provide too. As they decay, they become habitat for a lot of species, insects, bats, cavity nesting birds, raccoons, bears even, will live in these large cavities, and those require time as well. Old growth forests definitely have cultural, social, and spiritual significance, and so we definitely want to protect those values. When we are looking at old growth forests, they do have human histories as well, and there's a lot of reverence and respect, and people who have recognized the intrinsic value of older forests. And then old growth forests can give us some sense of scientific baseline. So what was going on with forests 200 years ago, 400 years ago, some of those legacies are going to be present when you look at these old forests today. Okay, so in terms of the environmental ethics portion of this, I want to talk about some of our challenges to conserving across centuries. So this is longer than our lifetimes. So what are the decisions we can make today that are going to influence these systems that operate on much longer timescales than we do? The first question there is, how do we extend our understanding of forests as a dynamic system to multi-century timescales? So this is more than the research we can conduct in a 5-year period. So how do we actually understand what's going on in these forests? A lot of our forestry knowledge is based on forests as an agricultural product. And so looking at how do trees grow to give us timber and wood products, and what are the conditions where we can make that yield the largest, or thankfully now the most sustainable. They're not necessarily focusing on the holistic ecosystem picture of forests, and that trend up until recently, that wasn't really a part of the research being done in a lot of forests. And then we've lost a lot of indigenous knowledge around old forests, where, what are the fire cycles, the fire regimes that you might see in old forests? How do certain species propagate, or what are the cycles that old tree or big trees might grow on? There might be ebbs and flows according to some of the changes in those canopies. And then the human connections to those forests and the human manipulation of those forests for long timescales before European colonization. And then, like I mentioned, the studies on the dynamics of forests are difficult to conduct beyond the lifetime of one person. And part of that is our institutions. We can't get funding to do long-term studies. They're not at the top of the list. But I do want to give a shout out to one very interesting researcher. Her name is Nalini Nadkarni, and she is one of the most prominent canopy researchers. She's actually climbing up there for most of her career in doing that. And in the canopy, she was seeing things people had actually never seen before because nobody had gone up there. And she was finding on top of branches soil that was this thick. And in her studies, she took a strip of that moss and soil layer off of the branch, and she studied it for 30 years. And she said she only started to see recolonization of that moss at 30 years. So that's a big implication to what is happening when we remove the large trees from a forest that have had this legacy for a long time. Next question, same question. Here's some other interesting research on developing understanding of how long trees can actually live. So in the 1950s, the Silvics manual that a lot of foresters used put species like red maple at 150 years, but recent research is showing us 300 years is possible and not necessarily uncommon in older forests. And so you can see this difference across multiple species. This was conducted further north from here, but they were very off, 198 years off with maximum age. And so if we assume that trees can only live so long, we're maybe not giving them their due to actually live beyond that. And then how do we actually know these ages? And one technique I just want to introduce you to is taking a core from a tree and counting the rings, which works better on some species than others, and in certain conditions better than others. But here is a hemlock that is 651 years old. You can't know this by looking at the exterior of a tree. Some people have tried to do some basic equations of a tree is this large and it grows this fast, therefore it's this many years old. But once again, trees don't read textbooks. There's always opportunities for us to be surprised by this. And it's often not the biggest tree in a forest that is the oldest. And lichen and mosses are huge indicators of age and health of a forest that are really, really understudied. Some of these species may take a very long time to reproduce. And I think some lichen only reproduce they only spread fractions of a millimeter every year. So if you see large colonies of certain lichen species, it tells you that it's been undisturbed and relatively stable there for a long time. And then another understanding of the importance of time in a forest, here's a plant that you might see in our eastern deciduous forests that's called bloodroot. And bloodroot is, the seeds are distributed by ants, not by birds, by wind, or mammals, or anything, by ants. So that tells you that those seeds can only distribute so far. So if you see a large spread of bloodroot in a forest, that also can tell you that they're really sensitive to the disturbance in that soil, and they take a long time to colonize an area. Okay, and then the next challenging question, how do we ensure forest continuity for multiple generations into the future? And what do we see as the major threats to that continuity? So I want to talk a little bit about tenure. So when I say tenure, it's referring to the idea of how we determine how land is owned, used, and transferred in our society. And so the questions we want to ask about the tenure of our forests are, how do we make forest management decisions and craft land relationships ethically for the future? I can't answer that in one sentence or one lifetime, but it's something that we all need to consider every time we make a decision about what our land is going to look like. And who gets to decide that? So in the United States, we have bifurcated land into public and private largely, and so people are making decisions through different mechanisms to shape that land. And supposedly our public lands are supposed to be a decision from all of us. So we need to look closely at how decisions are being made for those public lands. And then I think I just always want to reference the principle of 7 generations from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We need to be making decisions for 7 generations into the future. That's how we create sustainability and how we make ethical decisions for future generations. And then just one statistic here, forest land uses in the United States, there's a lot of production land. And so, we're in a building that has a lot of wood. We use paper products and wood products every day. They're coming from somewhere. We do have preservation forests. These might be in wilderness areas or other protected lands. And then we have other types of forests. These might be family forest lands that aren't necessarily production, but aren't necessarily fully protected as preservation lands. And a recent study has shown us how much of our old growth is split between these different categories. And mainly what I want to show here is how private land is the majority of our forest land in the United States. These are all federal institutions or state institutions or agencies that manage land. And so we can have a say on some of these as public lands, and then others we want to set up our society and our forest management institutions in a way that we do see the important things being protected. So what are some long-term protection mechanisms for these old growth forests across our public and private lands? I'll start with private lands and just tell you briefly that conservation easements are one of the most powerful tools we have right now. So these are legal agreements that land stays in a certain state, whether that's not developed, doesn't have an apartment complex built on it. There's a forever wild easement out there that you're letting passive management guide what's happening in that forest. And then other uses, it might be agricultural land that's under a conservation easement. And then when you have this conservation easement, it's basically an agreement between the owner and another party that land is only certain things can happen on that landscape. Development is not allowed, but farming is, for instance. Timber production is, but development is not. And that third party enforces the agreement. They are rather expensive. So I wish they weren't, because that would make them a more widespread tool, but there are costs to getting them set up because they're expected to last in perpetuity, which is supposed to be as long as we can manage as a society, as long as our institutions survive. And the trade-offs here are that when you put a conservation easement on your land, there's a reduction in the value of that property because it's taking it away from being developed or other uses. So naturally, that property value goes down. But the owner gets a tax break for putting the conservation easement on there. And it can make your land more difficult to sell unless you find a very wonderful conservation buyer interested in inheriting an easement. And then the land trusts that are that party enforcing the terms of it may not be forever as well. And so I listed just 3 in Georgia here briefly: the Georgia Piedmont Land Trust, Southeastern Trust for Parks and Land, and the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust that have properties and work with owners throughout the state. And there's definitely more that I didn't list here. But I also wanted to recognize the Northeast Wilderness Trust, who operate in the New England states, and they only do what we call forever wild conservation easements, where you can't cut the trees on that land. That it's essentially private wilderness. And then public lands. How do we ensure long-term protection for our old growth forests on public lands? Largely it's by statute. So it's what's in our laws. Wilderness areas is probably our premier example of our opportunity to see forests sustain its old age or grow into that. And that wilderness areas have to be designated by Congress. So it's not an easy hurdle. Some states have state laws that protect any old growth forests on state conservation lands. And those, we see a new one every few years. But I think Maryland may have been the last one to say that, on any of their conservation lands, if they run into old growth forests, they have to leave it. And then these long-term protection mechanisms are going to cover our federal lands, so our national forests, national parks. There are state lands when there are opportunities there, state parks, state forests, wildlife areas, natural heritage areas. And then we also can have this happening on our local level. So you could have your city or county parks that are committing to having passive management areas. And then some short-term protection mechanisms. And these can apply to either public or private lands. We see them popping up on both. One is forest management plans. And so large portions of forests will often work with a forester to create a plan into the future to make it fit the vision of that forest owner. And there's different requirements. Different programs require a forest management plan to exist. But generally, it's the best practice to know what you're looking to do in the next 30 years, especially if you have someone else inheriting that land, what the vision is. And so the Old Growth Forest Network has been working with foresters and forest owners to put in old growth into their plans, plan to have old forest. And we have a template for that on our website. And then other short-term protection mechanisms might be local resolutions, local administrative policies that your parks department puts into place to set aside a piece of land. And we hope that those turn into long-term protections. We often work with parks departments to have them sign a memorandum of agreement to start the process of exploring more long-term protection measures when they do find that they have older forest on their park lands. And then there's some conservation programs which often will offer some sort of incentive or help for people who want to steward old forests. And the incentives, especially financial incentives, can be really important because that forest owner, they want to see old forest on their land, but often those older trees can be more valuable for timber, and they're foregoing timber income to keep the forest standing. And I hope that we develop these more to see them match maybe that value, but forest stewardship programs are often at state levels, and they help by perhaps providing resources or doing cost share measures for things people want to do to promote the health of their forest. Carbon credits, which is a growing, complex idea that the longer a person lets their forest grow and absorb and sequester and store carbon as a benefit to society, they should get paid for it. And the people paying for it are the ones who are emitting carbon. And there's currently not really an opportunity for older forests to benefit from this or protected forests to benefit from this because they want to see forests that are otherwise going to be cut right now be the ones who get that. They're like the low-hanging fruit. So it's a stopgap to get a little more carbon sequestered by those forests that might be cut rather than the ones that are going to sequester it anyway. And then current use tax programs, which let me explain this a little bit. When you own a large piece of land, it's generally valued at the market value, which can be rather high, especially if someone wants to develop that land. However, if you're using that land for farmland or other types of uses at this moment of time, it's a way for you to be taxed at that different value. And up until recently, most current use tax programs could cover forested lands, but it required them to be harvested. or a forest management plan that had various harvests into the future. And that was a way to ensure that that was truly working land. It wasn't just land that was waiting to be developed. But recently, Vermont added a category for reserve forest lands, where they will give you the tax break for the conservation value of letting your forest grow old, which is a really great measure, and I hope that it spreads to other state programs. So the Old Growth Forest Network is trying to promote old growth as a goal. Since we have such little remnants of it left right now, this is how we're designing a future for it. And so I just want to give a quick example here of the age of forests in Michigan. I just happen to have this data most readily available, so we're going with Michigan, which has a lot of forests that have been cut and regrown. And so most of the forests there are in that 40 to 80 year range. How can we set up ourselves to see populations here? We want to see at least a little bit of forest in these much older categories. And so that takes deliberate action because if your Silvix manual says that they're only living to 140 years or 150 years, you might be planning to harvest them at that point instead of letting them grow old. And there are some places that are already doing this. And so I just want to point out Florida state parks. Many of them have put old growth forests into their land management plans. And that's really great to see, where they do have older forests or forests that aren't ripe for timber production. They're going to make sure those become old growth forests. That is not common for our state park programs, but we're hoping that it will be, that we can push the needle on this for state park programs to be an example of really good stewardship for our older forests. Okay, so I want to talk about the human component of old forests. So how do we consider the influence of people in these goals? And there's an idea that has really fallen out of favor that our wilderness areas should be and are devoid of human touch. And we know that that is inaccurate for the history pre-colonization for a lot of areas, and isn't necessarily the best scenario for all places. So I want to understand a little bit of the ideas around, where can we have a hand in this, rather than just let forests be self-willed and grow into the future on their own. What might be the role of people? And there's been a little bit of development around this idea and research around, can we speed up the process of developing an old growth forest? Here's a guide out of New England and New York's forests talking about some measures that you can do if you don't want to wait around for it to happen naturally. So they put in this graph of approximately our forests are 100 years old in that region of the country because they were logged and turned into farmland, and we've let them recover up until this point across a lot of that landscape. And then if we're not doing anything and just letting the forests grow as they do, in about 100 years, you'll start to see some of these benchmark old growth characteristics show up in that forest over time. But in their recommendations for some of the more active things you can do in a forest, they can see some of these benchmarks show up about 50 years earlier. And I just want to note that 50 years is just a physical characteristic of the forest. The time of that 50 years is still, that hasn't been invested in the forest, so you can't really grow lichen actively by doing this, but you can get your trees to grow a little bigger, a little faster by reducing some of the competition of trees around them. And here's just one example of something they propose, and it is that if you want to see more large diameter standing dead trees, which I called snags earlier, and recognize the really important function of them in terms of carbon storage, roosting site for bats, microrefugia for these little sensitive species, what you can do is you can leave large trees. If you were going to get in there and cut some of them, you can just leave them, which is pretty obvious. Or you can girdle them, which is where you intentionally kill them, but let them decay in place by removing just a section of the bark, which cuts off its ability to send nutrients up the bark layer of that tree. And that does create snags, yes, it's true. You could do prescribed fire. You could get in there and you could have your hand. You could design things. You could play God, all of those things to see the visual and kind of functional old growth characteristics come in sooner. But I do want to have a little warning here. Every decision that you might make there does come with trade-offs. So you are designing the forest rather it being self-willed. And in a way, some of our designs of forests in the past have gotten us into really bad places. So we need to be very thoughtful about what we're going to do in our old growth forests. And then many elements only time can create. But we may not have the time. So if you have a species that depends on some of these old growth characteristics that you can create, you may be helping them out in particular. You may want to help them out by doing this. What if the trees you decide to girdle are the ones that are going to live to 400, 450 years? We don't know. We're making that decision for the forest. And so that leads to some pictures of, or some questions of what we wrestle with in the idea of creating a forest in our vision. So how do we choose which trees are the future in different capacities? Which are the ones that we create snags out of? Which are our legacy trees? Which are the ones that get removed for other ones to grow bigger? Should all forests be shaped to human desires? There's a phrase that every decision you make in a forest is management. It doesn't have to be going in there with a chainsaw or planting trees or anything. Just making the decision is a management decision. Maybe passive management is management. So there isn't really a do nothing in this circumstance. What is our future climate going to look like? There is a whole field of climate adapted forestry where people are considering, we see these ecosystems and we understand their function today. Is it necessarily going to be like that in the future? What can we predict? What can't we predict? Some people are planting trees in a zone expecting them to be growing in hotter temperatures, across the next few decades. We might see novel pathogens and invasive species. So forests are functioning differently now than they did 200 years ago because of various pests and pathogens. We're losing dominant trees. Are we going to see new things come in? And unfortunately, we do see new pathogens and pests affecting our forests. And we don't know what the future is going to look like for them or how they might be able to sustain or succumb to those threats. And then what is the baseline we're trying to return to when we say we want to create a future for old growth forest? We're not going to be able to do that back to that map that said 1670 or 1620, which it had old growth forest across the country. It's a reality that we can't do that, but what can we do? And what conditions may never return now that we're on a trajectory of a changing climate and novel pathogens, and human influence has changed. So I mentioned prescribed fire. In areas that saw fire, the indigenous-led fire for a long time that we then took away when the Forest Service started managing those lands and saw fire as a threat. Can we ever go back to when they had the original fire regime that we're looking at? It's very difficult, especially when human communities have moved into these forests and get really scared at the idea of wildfire coming near them. So I will end this by telling you a little bit about the Old Growth Forest Network. I wanted to start with the big thoughts and then finish with this because these are all things that we wrestle with but are trying to move the needle for old growth forests across our country. So our mission is to create a national network of protected old growth forests. And this is our website that you can see, oldgrowthforest.net. I recommend that you go check it out. We were founded in 2011. We have a staff of 10. And we are a 501c3. And we operate from donors. So we currently have one government grant, gonna knock on wood, and otherwise generous people want to share in this mission. We are founded by Joan Maloof, and she's a writer and forest ecologist, and so you may have seen some of these books around. One of them was Teaching the Trees here, was published by UGA Press. And this is the current network of forests that we partner with across the country. So we have 306 forests across 39 states, and these are all forests that have made the commitment to keep their forests passively managed, free from commercial logging. And some of them, the acreages range from maybe 5-acre areas in urban forests to entire wilderness areas that get recognized in our network. And there's a concentration primarily in the Mid-Atlantic area because that's where our organization started out of in Maryland, but we're certainly reaching wherever forests grow. And we go county by county to try and make sure that there's at least one forest that is preserved in each county. And so this is a generations long goal. I'm not gonna live to see the end of it, but I have lived to see us reach 10%. So that's really great. We go through all of these policies that I mentioned, whether it's a forest management plan, conservation easement, deed, state policy, local policy, with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that there are documented protections for these forests. And I think that in addition to connecting people with this forest is the most important work we do, because we have found really high quality old growth remnants that maybe a park system has never recognized through that lens. And in their policies, they could sell parkland for development. And so we, in that circumstance, would try and work with the city or county to try and at least recognize the conservation need there and put them on a pathway to get those properties longer protected, whether it's creating a conservation parks program or signing a memorandum of agreement for the time being. But most of these have pretty strong protections that prohibit commercial logging within these areas. And all of them are open to the public. So that's another important criteria. And we want people to see and experience old growth forests or future old growth forests and connect with them. So you can go onto our website and see a map that's prettier than this one, and click on all of these forests and see visitation information, what special features that you might see in those forests, trails that we recommend, pictures of them. So I'd say that this map creates the best road trip you could ask for. And when you go to one of the forests in our network, you might see this plaque here. So you'll know that it's recognized as a place that your children or grandchildren could go see without having to worry about it being converted or developed or logged. And then once again, these are the criteria for a forest joining our network. They have old growth or mature second growth forest. There are many counties that do not have any old growth forests left. So we are looking for the next oldest thing. They allow public access. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily public land. We do have a lot of land trust lands, which are technically private, that allow and encourage public visitation, have trails, have maps, all of that good stuff. And then they're protected from commercial logging or commercial timber harvests. And so that commercial part means that we allow for like hazard trees to be removed, prescribed fire to take place, certain processes for forest health that might go on, or restoration where it might be an old pine plantation site that had a core that never got touched, and people are working on that. And then the policies that we look through, here's just a long list, but they can look differently for every type of site we work on. But we do look to verify that at the federal level, if they're in a wilderness area or the policies from the National Park Service, we look through the particular policies for things like scenic areas and special botanical areas. At the state level, we have this huge database of all the state policies for all the different types of conservation lands they have. And so there's a pretty large gap for the forest protection in things like state parks. And we want to see that gap filled. And so we try and work with states to to understand that there is vulnerability there, especially if they do have these little remnants of older forest. And then county and city level. And then others, forest management plans, conservations, deed restrictions. And then the broader goals of creating this network are finding these remnants of old growth or helping people understand what it looks like and how it functions, protecting these places, and then connecting people with them. And so beyond just creating this network of forests, it's a network of people who will go to the bat for the forests in their area. Our ability to come and give educational talks to folks like y'all. We do work with private landowners who want to see or steward old growth forests on their land to connect to them with foresters who have similar goals. Things like that. And then here's just a little look at Georgia. So we haven't had a lot of attention on Georgia, but I'm working to change that. And we have 8 sites currently designated in the network across the state, primarily in the northern part of the state. The dots are where we've been nominated forests. So we maintain a database of over 1,000 forests that people have nominated to us as future places where they do see old growth characteristics or mature forest characteristics that would be a good fit for our network. And I have a team of 8 people who are helping to work with those landowners, go through those policies, help plan the events where we get to have a celebration that a forest has joined the network, all of that. And then we do have some volunteers. And so we operate a network of volunteers around the country who help us identify sites, go and do a site visit, take pictures, and keep an eye on that place into the future. Because we are creating this network, but we need the support from people across the United States to make sure that the understand when there might be a fire or trail closure, updates and things like that, or when we see logging that wasn't supposed to happen in a forest, and we can go back to those documents that said it wouldn't happen. And then if you want to connect with us about Georgia, nominate forests, become a volunteer, or just learn more about these sites, this is Sierra Wilbur, and she's our Southeastern Regional Manager, and you can email her. We do want to hear from you. So as you go on your journeys and you see places that you remember this talk and you say, that is an old tree with a lot of moss on it, or that is an interesting old log, and there's a lot of them here. Let me nominate that forest. Please do. So you can go on our website, nominate a forest. And please just connect with us. So you can email, you can go to our website, and we are all over social media as well. So check us out there. And thank you for letting me come tell you about it. Yeah.
Question for you. If you go back, it looked like you had a dot and a
I think that might be Tallahassee forest. If I had to guess, it would be that. Yeah. So I'm not sure what, is it open yet? Is it soon to be open? Does anyone know?
Certainly you're allowed to access it.
Okay, gotcha. Sometimes we wait because we are working through 2,300 counties. Sometimes we wait for a parking lot to be built. Yes.
I was wondering, what is there a problem that you're seeing with invasives?
Certainly, and it's largely in our suburban and urban forests that are in the network, because invasive species usually come in with people. And typically, older forests are more resilient or resistant to the introduction of invasive species, especially if they are in wilderness or roadless areas. But there is a lot of stewardship work to try and eliminate those where we see them. And I think one really good example is Fernbank Forest in Atlanta. It used to be covered in English ivy, and they've done a killer job to open the forest floor back up and let those spring ephemerals reappear. And it was a monumental task, but shows it can happen.
So are you monitoring, is anybody monitoring to make sure that there's not such things like invasive in the
So that would be the forest manager probably for these properties, which we just partner with them. And so we try and hear about it, but with 300 forests, can't hear about everything. Yep.
I think at one point you said you were 10% to your goal. What is 10% of what?
So every county that can grow a forest is on our list. And that is about 2/3 of the counties across the United States. That's where we want to see a forest that is either protected as old growth or allowed to age into it. It's a huge task, but that was the mission that was laid out when this organization started in 2011. And when we consider, there's a middle of the country is a lot of scrub, grasslands, desert areas where they don't have a large amount of canopy coverage in there, a large amount of forest in there. And so we do have a little bit of a threshold where we wouldn't be looking to have a forest in that county. So I think it's 2,310 out of about 3,200 counties in the United States. So yeah, 10% was good to hear.
So could you comment like on the relationship between climate change, fire management, and then overall forest health? I mean, particularly like what's going on out west with these massive fires. I mean, is there a relationship as between the way the forests are being managed, or is it really more of a drying out of the forest? Does that have any relationship to the age of the forest? Or, I mean, I would assume an older growth forest would be less likely to burn than a younger forest.
So this isn't my specialty, but I can just reference a couple of relationships that we've seen pop up in research on where high severity fires have happened in the past couple of decades. And generally older forests in that region do have the ability to, temperate forests do have the ability to retain more moisture. And the thicker bark of older trees are a little more fire resilient. And so a fire can move through, and because their canopies are much higher too, the fire won't reach the crown, won't kill the older trees, but we've had some really severe fires also where that has happened. And there's research looking into what are the conditions that forests can survive these fires, or where they're more likely to take place. And I know in the plantation forests in the West, fires can move through those a lot more quickly and more severe because you don't have the complexity and the moisture retention and things like that in them. So those are just some things I've seen come out of reviews of different studies of forest fire, but it's really complex and there's so many factors that shape a fire that I can't speak beyond that. Mm-hmm. But prescribed fire does remove some of the fuels that would make a fire more intense at a controlled level.
So in Georgia, there's a big movement to convert most of the, I guess, scrap forest products to pellets, pelletize the hardwoods and send them primarily to Europe. Do y'all work with that as far as trying to preserve hardwood forests and keep them intact, and I guess protect them from these pelletized plants?
Typically, the source of those pellets, thankfully, aren't coming from our oldest forests, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And generally, when we're looking at what happens to the carbon of a forest, we want to see it stay out of the atmosphere longer rather than shorter, and pellets are on the shorter end of that. And I don't think yet we've seen any of our forests turn into pellets. I'll say that. Yeah. Yes.
You had mentioned kind of like, what are we, like, when you're talking about, kind of in the sense of manufacturing locally forests, kind of speaking of the process, like, what are we restoring it back to? I'm a historic preservation student, so kind of looking at the cultural landscape of the forest, I feel like it seems like an old growth kind of is growing past that cultural landscape in the way that you're kind of removing it a little bit, like the human influence. But I would love to like know your thought on like kind of including cultural landscapes and like recognizing human impact while kind of developing this network of old growth forests and how those two kind of work together.
So we actually do have a handful of forests that are on historic properties, and that just speaks to kind of the diversity of ways that those properties were used, and a lot of them did have a parcel of forest that either it was ignored or the landowners specifically wanted it to be like that. So I think of the William Cullen Bryant homestead has a fantastic old growth forest on it. And there's some other properties in Virginia specifically is where we've seen a couple of those, in Pennsylvania. Like Falling Water is an example where there has been impact. There's built environments and there's really beautiful built environments within the forest. We're not trying to erase human impact there, but we're trying to let the forest have the best opportunity to be self-willed moving forward. And there's this idea when you're trying to figure out how old a forest is, of forest forensics, that's very interesting, where you can look at the evidence of people and try and understand the history of it, stone walls, the layout of the forest, the species composition that can indicate what the history was there. Yes?
So I know you said that all of your forests already like a commitment is being allowed for public access, but I'm just wondering, out of your network, like, does a lot of them come from public access, or are a lot of them like privately owned and not through like conservation? What's the like, percentage? Or is it a mix of both?
I would say that the majority of the properties that have joined our network are public lands with the protection that comes from that. Particularly state natural areas or natural heritage areas are a prime example of where we see eye to eye immediately. And a lot of some of those don't allow public access for sensitive environments, but a lot of them do. But we also work with land trusts that own properties that they want people to come enjoy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a very particular role where you help us assess a county for the best forest to join the network. And so it's going and doing field visits, taking pictures, documenting what you see there, and helping us choose which forest or which two forests sometimes are the best fit, and being a part of the process of bringing into the network, like connecting with the landowner there, and then sometimes even hosting guided walks for us once a forest joins the network. Yeah, it's fun. Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions?
Yes. Are there any ways that you're trying to push the University of Georgia to join your network?
Oh, yes. Well, I would love to see a Coney Forest Park be a part of the Old Growth Forest Network. And it's tricky because universities are often thinking about where are they going to expand into. And so it's very difficult to get a university to decide that a part of their property is forever going to be like that. You see construction all around on many universities as they expand. But we do have examples in our network of universities that have a forest preserve and really understand the value of that for their community of students, researchers, all of that. But in terms of going through the bureaucracy of a university, it's a very large hurdle that we've experienced. So I would love to see it.
I had mentioned the botanical gardens, but does that have a long-term vision?
I haven't looked at their documents, so that's a good, these are questions you can be asking of the parks and places around you of, can I look at your management plan? and where's your oldest forest, and what is allowed or not allowed, or how are you going to expand or stay as is? So those are good questions to ask. And we also have access to a growing body of data of like LiDAR imagery and other sources of geospatial information of where the oldest forests are. And so this gives us an entirely new approach of seeing those hotspots and then going in and looking at who is the landowner and having these conversations with them. So I'll see if they pop up.
Really what you see is the tallest forest, right? Like you don't know age from like
Right.
they're like tall forest.
Height, and I think they do have a couple of other indicators that, yeah, of nuance that they can pull into that, but generally it is height. And they're trying to sensitize the models to more forest types, but generally the ones they like the most are where tall trees are equivalent to oldest trees.
Since we're talking about a couple of different sites in Athens that come to mind, if your mission is to get one site in every county, how do you balance kind of your limited time and resources if you start getting multiple sites nominated from one county? Do you kind of say, wait, we've already got one, we need to move on to the other county?
That's exactly right. So we try and work in clusters because we often have to travel to these places and we're a small staff, or work with local volunteers that can help us in those clusters. So if we get a nomination for one county, we'll often start looking at what is around it. And so there's a lot of potential here. Georgia has a lot of private forest land that is not old. So we're trying to find those special remnants, and especially along our river's edges and our bottomland forests. They're hard to access, but there can be some really spectacular things in there. And so I'm thinking of these two nominations in particular have very old bald cypress trees, but they're difficult to get to. So we have to think about, weigh these different criteria of, is it a good fit or not? Some of our forests are only accessible by boat, so that still counts.
And when you define the lower limit of acreage, what's the acreage?
It depends on if it's a developed area, generally around it. So if it's a suburban county, typically those forests are not going to be terribly large. I think actually one of our sites for Gwinnett County is called Little Mulberry Park, and it's at almost 1,000 acres, which is pretty good for an extremely developed county. But we have sites as small as 10 acres, which we'll take what we can get in those circumstances. Sometimes there's not a bigger piece of forest in those areas.
What
Yes.
do you have labeled as the original forest of Atlanta? Is that Fernbank?
So that is a small network of forests within Atlanta that are fairly close together. Some of the parks like Cascade Springs Nature Preserve, Fernbank, smaller parcels that our volunteer for that area found quite a few Piedmont old growth remnants, and she wanted them all to be recognized. And they were so close together that we made it one idea. Yeah.
So since majority of the old growth forests are private, do you guys see in the future as your mission progresses, being oh well, all the forests left that we want are all private, how do we get these if they don't want the conservation piece, or do you see that being kind of a big issue as you move forward?
It's a challenge now, and certainly if we see sweeping protections for our public forests, we'll change our approach because we have a lot, we've lost a lot. So there's no end to the opportunity to restore old growth with our current circumstances. And there are some tricky things about industrial forests that may have old growth remnants in them. There's not a lot that dictates what can and cannot be done in those areas. There are some programs, like if a paper company wants to have certifications, they have best practices they have to follow, and that certainly cutting old growth would not be one of them. But if they don't have any accountability around it, we can't really do anything. But we can think about, how can we help incentivize them to keep those forests standing, especially if they could make them a lot of money. And the one thing I didn't put into writing on these slides is social pressure. So a lot of forests have been saved by social pressure. And activism and advocacy. And so that's a layer of short-term protection that we can look to.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Please do check out the map on our website if you're curious, and you're welcome to email me.
I'm sure you have Instagram and
Oh, yeah.
all the things.
Yeah, let me go back to that.
Haha. Yep.